Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take on U.S.-Brazil relations, which have been troubled for some time, but are now in crisis. In crisis because of a Trump announcement to impose 50% tariffs against Brazil, not for trade reasons, but because he's angry about the politics, angry about efforts to investigate and imprison former President Jair Bolsonaro, and also for legislation moving against social media companies, mostly U.S. social media companies. A few things that are important here. First, this is clearly an abuse of executive authority. The IEPA capacity of the U.S. to drive tariffs is meant for a national security emergency. There is nothing about this decision to impose tariffs that would reflect a national security emergency. So the president doesn't have authority. Now, the Supreme Court hasn't yet ruled on that, but will probably in the fall. And I have expected, but I more strongly expect now that Trump is using this, pushing the boundaries even further against Brazil, that he will have his wings clipped in the ability and the power, the authority of sitting president to use a national security emergency to put tariffs arbitrarily on another country. Also, this is a direct intervention into the domestic politics of Brazil. It's very clear that if another country were to do that to the United States, were to say, if you don't change the way you do legislation on a completely unrelated topic, or if you don't change a Supreme Court ruling, which the president, of course, has no influence over, then we're going to punish your country economically. I mean, first of all, the U.S. would, as an exceptionalist sort of regime that believes that it gets to set the rules of the road and other countries don't because they're not as powerful. It's hard for Americans to even imagine that another country could do that to the U.S. But certainly, if they tried, Americans, and I'm talking everyone, Democrats, Republicans, across the board, House, Senate, President, doesn't matter the party, would be outraged. And that's precisely what Trump is doing to Lula right now. He's also picking a fight on issues that Lula doesn't have influence over. I mean, the parties in Congress are actually quite fragmented. There's a lot of coalition building that has to happen. So it's not as if Lula is the one that is personally driving this social media regulation. And he has influence there. He has no real influence on the Supreme Court. And I mean, if there's one thing that Trump should understand himself, because he's been on the receiving end of it, it's that a sitting president does not get to tell the Supreme Court, no, I don't like your ruling. I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to do something else. So even if the Brazilian president was well disposed to Trump, and he's not, this would be a no-win, no capacity to respond constructively situation. And yet, it isn't that. It's actually the beginning of an electoral cycle in Brazil where Lula has not done particularly well. He's been relatively unpopular, though still competitive, in part because of the economy and taking blame for it. And now Trump is saying, I'm going to make the economy worse. But he's saying he's going to make the economy worse in support of Bolsonaro. And Brazil is at least as divided politically as the United States is. And what I think is likely to happen here is Lula is going to lean into this and is going to absolutely escalate this fight. He refused to even accept the letter that was written by Trump, thinking of it as offensive. But I think that they're going to relish a fight here to blame Bolsonaro, who is otherwise has no accountability for the economy right now. He's not in power, and say, yeah, we're taking a hit because of him. And interestingly, Bolsonaro and his son Eduardo, who the former president has been thinking about, putting forward as the candidate to succeed Lula in upcoming elections, has absolutely wanted Trump's help, and they've been lobbying for Trump's help. But they didn't want tariffs because they knew that that would be a much bigger problem for the country that they could have blame for. Instead, they wanted Trump to use Magnitsky legislation to go after and sanction individuals that have been trying to hurt Bolsonaro, specifically Supreme Court Justice Moraes, who has also been a big driver on the social media side. Well, Trump may well end up doing that. But now that the tariffs have been announced, they're not as easy to pull back unless there's a climb down from Brazil, which again, I expect is not only not forthcoming, but I think Lula is going to lean into this. And this has the potential to backfire on Bolsonaro himself. So look, this is a clear point that to the extent that Trump has been driving trade policy for lots of different reasons, because there are deficits with some countries and he wants those trade balances to be made more fair, because he wants to align more countries with the Americans against China, for example, because he's trying to increase revenue, use this as a sort of tax collection. He wants to have more reshoring to the United States. None of those things are at play here with Brazil. This is purely a political vendetta against Lula, against the Supreme Court, in favor of someone that Trump individually likes. It doesn't advance the American national interest. The U.S. is in trade surplus with Brazil. And so you can find arguments. You can say that Trump has not executed well on the trade side, and that I certainly agree that he's made a lot of mistakes there, and there haven't been as many agreements as he's wanted, and he's getting impatient with it. But there's at least different kinds of logic that you can use to describe a lot of those tariff impositions. You can't do that with this on Brazil, and I suspect that this is going to blow up ultimately in Trump's face. That's it for me, and I'll talk to y'all real soon.